All right, hello everyone. Eric Marks here again with FindingMiddleEarth.com. And today we're going to talk about the most natural way, in my opinion, to saturate your photos. It's a really cool trick in Photoshop. It's super simple. Before we get started, if you guys head over to my website at FindingMiddleEarth.com, click the big subscribe button in the top right-hand corner, and you'll get instant access to a free 45-minute What's in My Camera Bag video, where I talk about my cameras, camera bags, tripods, all that good stuff. Also, my landscape photography HDR blending course, which is 10 hours of Photoshop tutorials. Still on sale for only $25. It's normally $99, so pick that up while you can. All right, so let's talk about this for a second. So I get questions pretty often on the best way to do a certain thing. And let's just go ahead and level the playing field here. There really are very few things in post-processing that are just like an end-all, be-all, best way to do something. There's multiple ways you can do stuff, and I find that it always kind of depends on the specific image that you're editing. For example, sometimes I'll use a noise reduction tool that I like to use in the Nick Collection plugin. It does great on, say, 80% of the photos, but those 20% of the photos with the certain lighting situations, certain kind of color noise or whatever, it just doesn't work very well. So then I just hop into Adobe Camera Raw or other tools. So sometimes you have to kind of adapt your post-processing tools to the specific image. You have to do that really all the time. But I'll show you kind of a really good go-to way to naturally saturate your photos here. So before we actually show you the tool, you have to understand something. I'm sure you've heard of the different color spaces like RGB and CMYK. Whether you understand them or not, I'm not sure, but quickly, RGB means red, green, blue, and CMYK means cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Okay, let's get rid of black for a second because that's not an actual vibrant color, and let's just talk about CMY and RGB. So imagine they're just right next to each other here in a parallel lines. Okay, CMY, RGB. So in that order, CMY, RGB, those colors are opposite of each other. So cyan is opposite of red, magenta is opposite of green, and yellow is opposite of blue. So in order to saturate, keep that in mind. The opposites, CMY, RGB, are opposite of each other. So let's hop into the adjustment panel here in Photoshop. Hop into this tool here called Selective Color, okay? And this gives us some options. So you can see under colors that we can target each color. So we can target the reds, the yellows, the greens, cyans, blues, magentas. We're not going to touch the whites, neutrals, and blacks. We're just touching the colors here. So if we hop into reds, for example, okay, we can target the reds, and then there's all these sliders where we can kind of fine-tune the selection of the red tones. And under the red tones, you'll notice something. There's no red slider. So how do we saturate the reds? Well, that's why understanding CMYK and RGB are very important, because in order to saturate the red, we need to go minus on the cyan, because cyan is opposite of red, red is opposite of cyan. So if we go negative on the cyan, watch the little barn there in the water. It just really saturated the reds. Let's go back. Negative. And if we go positive with the cyans, it's desaturating, because remember, they're opposites. So let's just leave that at negative 100 on the cyan. We're not going to leave it that way permanently. We're just going to set ourselves up with a little preset here. So now let's hop into the yellows, all right? And with that same principle of opposites, just keep that in mind. So yellows, under this one, there's an actual yellows slider. So we don't have to do any kind of fancy sliding. We just take the yellows and go to positive 100. Over here on the greens, let's see, the green is opposite of what? RGB, CMY, so green is opposite of magenta. So we have to go negative on the magenta, which will bump the greens. See all the greens in the trees? I just bumped that. Let's head into the cyans. There's an actual cyan slider here, so we just, super simple, go positive 100. Go to the blues, and blue is the opposite of yellow, so go negative yellow. And then we hop into magentas, and there's an actual magenta slider. So we just throw that up to positive 100. Super simple. And I think we're done. Okay, we're done. So we've basically targeted each of the colors. Some of the color tones aren't even in this image. So like some of the yellows and blues, there aren't really much of those in this image. But it doesn't matter. So we just set ourselves up with kind of a preset here. So what we can do to save this, if you click on these little stacked lines here and you do Save Selective Color preset, just click that and name a preset and it'll save it for you under this little preset panel. So if I click that, I've already saved one called Natural Saturation. If I just click that, we're fine. By the way, you don't always have to have them all the way at 100, like negative 100, positive 100. You can have them at 50 or 20 or 10. Just make sure they're all equal. The reason I say make sure they're they're all equal, because if they're in equal amounts, then you're not going to have color banding issues, which means you're not going to have one color start to fall off when the other color starts. And when you do that, it's called color banding. You'll have like some halos and very noticeable gross artifacting where one color starts to stop and the other color starts. So it won't be a very smooth gradation between the colors. So for example, like reds and magentas can be very close sometimes. So if you have the reds at -100 and the magentas at like 20, well, there might be some kind of weird noticeable shift when the reds and magentas start and end with each other. Okay, so keeping this in mind that we've got our preset loaded here. Let me click on it, natural saturation, okay? First, let's look at a before and after. So that's before we did this, and this is after, okay? So I still think the barn is too saturated. I want to keep that nice and scaled back and still kind of rustic-y and faded, because it was kind of a gray day. But I remember when I was there, the greens were very poppy and kind of vibrant, and the water was kind of turquoise and green. It was really beautiful. So I'm going to work on the water and the surroundings, not so much the barn. So for this specific photo, I'm going to hop back into the reds, and I'm going to take that cyan slider back. I'm going to pull it back probably all the way to 0. Okay, because I think that the red barn was just fine on its own. It doesn't really need much of a color pop. Now, when I did that, I also need to realize that magenta is very close in color tone to the reds. So I need to hop into the magenta and affect that an equal amount. So I need to take the magenta to 0 as well. So there we go. All right, reds and magentas are both at 0. Everything else is still as it was at minus or positive 100. And now what we can do is you can select this layer and you can duplicate it as many times as you want to add crazy saturation. So if I hit Command J and J and J, okay, you can see it gets crazy, really crazy. But if we scale it back a little bit like this and just do 2 duplicates, you can see how natural the saturation is. I still think this is too saturated, but if you zoom in, I want you to see that there is no color banding or pixel shift or artifacting of any kind. We're zoomed in at 370% here, and even though I still think it's a little too electric green and too saturated, it's very natural. It's much more natural compared to something like just using a saturation slider inside of Lightroom or something and just kicking it up to 100. If you did that, you would noticeably be able to tell how horrible everything looks. So this is a very natural way compared to that. Eventually you will have color banding with any way of color if you push it to a crazy amount. Okay, I mean you just can't avoid that. But with this way, you can push it way further than your traditional saturation slider and still get really pretty results. Because I understand that there are some photographers that like their stuff really, really saturated. Like the Peter Lick, for example, right? He's like Mr. Saturation, and that's cool. That's his style, and he has obviously found out how to saturate in a very natural way because he doesn't have color banding or artifacting or anything like that. So this is a very clean way to do it. So what we can do is, I think the green needs to be more saturated than just this, which is just that first layer. But I think it needs to be less saturated than the second layer. There's like 3 ways I could handle this, okay? The first way is I could just take the opacity and drop it on this second layer, and that will affect all those tones for me, and 50% actually looks pretty good. Okay, if that didn't work, the other way I could handle it is that I could go into the green tones here, just on this second layer, this duplicate, and I could just take those magentas and I could drop those magentas a little bit, and that'll kind of rein back the saturation. Okay, and that also works very well. If both of those ways didn't work, then the kind of the fail-safe here is you can select the mask on this color, on this layer here, the second selective color layer. We hit Command I, which will invert the mask to black, which means it's going to hide everything. It's going to hide all that saturation. We hit B for the brush, make sure we're painting with white, and then we just manually paint it in. And you can make sure the opacity is what percentage you want to paint those greens in. So maybe we want to paint the greens in at only 40%. Well, all we do is get a big soft brush, and we just go to town, and we just start painting that in at only 40%. So as we roll over this, you can see it definitely changing and getting a little bit more saturated. But we're definitely not oversaturating it. We're just making those greens pop a little bit. And obviously, red and green naturally have a really good contrast off of each other anyway. So having that nice faded red barn with some beautiful green foliage around it is also just a nice little scene. I think this is one I'm probably going to end up doing a print series on, like maybe a limited edition 50 prints or something. I really like this one. Okay, so there you go. So that's a way too. We can manually paint it in, or we can affect the opacity over here. I showed you 3 ways to handle that. But there you go. In a nutshell, that's a very natural way to saturate this image. And if you want to have complete control over everything you've done now with the color, you can shift select both of these color layers, hit Command G to put them in a group. So now they're going to be controlled by one as one whole inside the group, and you can take the group opacity and you can lower that whole group, which is going to affect both of those layers. So maybe we want to rein it back even more. Let's go back, take the whole group to maybe 70-ish%, somewhere around there, and look at that. Before and after, before and after. It still adds some really nice pop in the greens, but we're not overdoing it. We're still staying very natural. We're avoiding all those issues, the color banding, the pixel shifting, the artifacting, whatever you want to call it. This is just a super nice, easy, I would call it a soft way to add color. It probably doesn't make sense, but in my head it does. A nice, soft, natural, normal way to add this. So there you go. I hope you guys enjoyed that. It's super simple. I probably elongated it a little bit more than I should have, but I know there's some beginners that follow my channel, so I wanted to make sure you guys understood the RGB, CMYK color scales and how the opposites worked off of each other. So, all right, if you guys have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I'm going to keep making some videos like this, just kind of quick Photoshop tips. It really seems to help you guys out. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.